Hey guys, today we're going to learn all about the CSS cascade, and you're going to understand why it's actually called a cascading style sheet after completing this lesson. So what exactly is the meaning of the cascading part of the cascading style sheet? Well, it's really only relevant when we think about multiple different conflicting CSS rules. So if you have different rules that target the same element, for example, in H1, then we have to determine which one is higher up in the hierarchy. And this method of working out which of the rules actually get applied and which ones get ignored is how our cascade comes to be. Imagine if you have a cascade where there is a pool at the top and then there is another one at the bottom. If we think about how the rule gets applied, then the browser is going to look at the water level. Imagine if this rule gets applied first, and then as the water falls down the cascade, it sees another rule that's applying to the same element. Then you will see this style, number 1, being applied. So multiple styles can be applied to the same thing, but because of the order of importance, the one that is the most important once you've finished the cascade is the one the user actually sees on screen. Here's an example. Let's say we've got a ordered list which has 3 list items. And then in our styles.css, we set all of the list items to have a green color. Now, once you run the code at this point, everything is going to turn green. And now we have a list of 3 ordered list items, all with green text. Now, however, if one of those list items happen to have a inline style where we've got the style attribute being set and we set it to a different color, in this case red, what do you think will happen when we run this updated code? Well, that is where our cascade comes in. The first level of applying style comes from the external style sheet, and then it's going to look to see, well, maybe there are internal styles being applied via the style tag. And if there aren't any, then it's going to look at the next level and see that, oh, are there any inline styles being applied? And this is the final style that gets applied to this particular list item. And so, in the end, we end up with everything being green, but then in the last minute, this one gets changed to red because of the way the cascade works. There are 4 broad categories which we look at when we're determining the overall level of importance of a CSS rule. And these categories are position, specificity, type, and importance. And I'm going to go through each of these with a code example. The first thing we look at the very top of the cascade is whether if a rule is at a higher or lower position in the CSS relative to other rules. Notice here I've got 2 rules applying to the same thing and setting the same property. I'm trying to set the color of the text red, but I'm also trying to set it blue. Well, in fact, they both happen, but the one that is lower down simply replaces the previous one. So first it becomes red and then immediately becomes blue. So this is what you're going to see on screen. The position of a CSS rule can apply to the position within the curly braces of a selector, but it could also be that you target the same element lower down in this. So I could target the li again down here, and I could set the color to green. And in this case, because this is even lower down than these 2 positions, so this is 1, 2, and 3, then this one is going to be the final one that we'll see. The lower down in a CSS external file or in an internal style element, the more important it is. If we're looking at this cascade, a rule that gets applied here will then be replaced by a rule that gets applied here and finally here. So the lower down the file the rule is, the more important it is. Now, the next category is the specificity. And CSS specificity refers to how specific a selector is in terms of the elements that you're applying the CSS rule to. As an example, let's say we create a list item element and we give it an ID that's equal to first ID, and then we give it a class that's equal to first class. And then finally, we give it the attribute of draggable as well. And this is our opening tag for our list item element. Now, if we look at this element and we think about the different ways that we can target this element, then these 4 CSS rules will all target this particular element, but they have different specificity. And they're listed in order. The first one selects all the list item elements. So there could be many other list item elements in our HTML file. So this is the least specific. It's the element selector. The next level of specificity is the class selector. Remember, the class selector starts with a dot. And this will select all the other list elements that have this class name, first class. And because we can have multiple different elements with the same class, for this reason, it is more specific than element, but it's also not the most specific way of selecting an element. The next one is selecting on attribute. Even though most sources will tell you that attribute and class are actually the same level of specificity, if you try it out, in most cases, the attribute will override the class. In this case, we're selecting on this attribute of draggable, and we're turning the list item that has that attribute set to the color of purple. And at this point of our code, if we didn't go any further, our text would look purple. So the final level of specificity and the most specific is the ID selector, which is denoted by the £sign or the hashtag sign. And this is the most specific because theoretically on a single web page, you should only have one particular ID name. So it essentially targets only one element on the page. So the order of specificity is ID, attribute, class, and element. If we think about our cascade, starting up here, firstly, we look to see if there are any element selectors that target a particular element. Then we look at class, then we look at attribute, and finally we look at ID. And if we applied the CSS rules in this order, then the final one will be the one that will be applied. So if all of these rules were applied to this particular element, then finally what we would see is the text would be orange. Now the next category is the type. We know that there are 3 different ways that we can apply CSS to a particular file. We can use the external style sheet, which is done using the link element, linking to a particular file in our project folder. Then there is internal CSS, which is done through the style element and putting the CSS in between the open and closing brackets of the style element. And finally, there is the inline style, where the CSS is applied through the style attribute inside the opening tag of an actual HTML element. In terms of the cascade, the most important are the styles that are applied inline, because this targets only one specific element. It's just this H1. It doesn't matter if you have 10 other H1s, this style is only going to be applied to this particular element. The next one is the internal, because the internal style sheet only exists inside one web page, whereas the external style sheet can actually be applied across many different HTML files as long as you all link to the same CSS file. In this order of our cascade, first we check if there are any styles relevant from the external style sheet, then we check whether if there are any from the internal style sheet, and finally if there are any inline styles. So then going down the cascade, this is the order where the CSS will get applied. If you had the same thing, so targeting the H1, setting its color here, here, and here, if they all target the same element and they're all trying to change the same property, say the text color, then this is going to be the one that will be shown on screen after you cascade through the different levels. The final thing, which is a keyword that you can apply to any CSS rule, is the important keyword. So you could have a color property set, and we know how we set it normally by simply adding a value after the property. But if you add a space and then you add this keyword, exclamation mark, and then the important word, then this is going to ensure that this is going to be the most important rule relative to that element. It doesn't matter how important this previous rule is. It could have been inline, or it could have been in an ID selector, or it could have been at the very bottom of the page. This rule is going to come out as the top trump. If you haven't already, I recommend taking notes of this page, because you can actually use this as a very handy way of working out why your CSS is not working, or when you're trying to do something specific and you're trying to make sure that a CSS rule gets applied. You can work your way from the top of the cascade all the way down. And there is obviously the higher level, which is the categories, position, specificity, type, and importance. And then within each cascade, you can imagine there's almost a mini cascade level where you determine which one is most important. Now we're going to try out some quizzes to enforce these rules, and I recommend taking a photo of this page and having it side by side while you do the quiz. Because remember, we're programmers, we're not here to memorize things. You can always look at this page when needed. This is the first quiz. Here we have an H1 element, and it's got a class as well as an ID. And there are two different CSS rules, and you can assume that they are both on an external style sheet. So our style.css. Now I want you to pick what will be the final color of this H1. Will it be blue or will it be green? And once you've made your selection, go ahead and use your QR code reader to scan the QR code that corresponds to your answer, blue or green, and then you will see a GIF to tell you whether if you got it right or wrong. So you have 30 seconds starting now. All right, so did you get it right? So in this case, we have a specificity battle, because this is a class selector and this is an ID selector. When we're looking at the specificity, the most specific always wins. So in this case, the ID will trump the class. And that's why if this code was run, which you can test out yourself, the color of the text will be green. So this was the correct answer. Did you get that right? If not, don't worry, we've got more questions coming up. This is our next quiz question. Again, we've got an H1 element, but notice this time it's got two classes applied, a class and another class. You can apply multiple classes to the same element as long as you add a space in between them. Now your job is to determine what is the final color of this H1. Is it going to be blue or is it going to be green? You have 30 seconds starting now. In this case, what's relevant is the position of our CSS rule. Because notice that they both have the same specificity. This is a class selector and this is also a class selector, and they both select the same element right here. And we're assuming that they're in the same file, so no difference in terms of external, internal, or inline. So then the only thing that matters is the order where they appear in the file. So remember that the cascade goes from the top to the bottom, and the ones at the bottom will be the ones that replace the ones at the top. So in this case, the final color of the H1 will be blue. When all other things are equal, for example, specificity, type, and importance, then we look at a specific category and see which one comes out trumps. Here's the final quiz question for today. Here we have an HTML file, and I want you to figure out what will be the final color of the H1. Will it be blue or will it be green? You have 30 seconds. Clock starts now. All right, so in this case, what we've got is an ID called an ID, and we have an inline style being applied. So remember, in terms of specificity, ID selectors are the most important. However, the CSS specificity as a category is not as important as the type of CSS being applied. This is going to be higher in terms of importance than this. Our final color for our H1 will in fact be blue. Remember that the cascade goes from here to here to here to here. Even if something that has won out on specificity, it can also lose because of the type. So you have to keep in mind the order of importance of the big categories, but also the order of importance of the small categories. So now it's time to try an exercise and write the code yourself so that we really solidify this knowledge in our minds and really get to grips with it. Go ahead and download the zipped starting code for the exercise from this lesson. Once you've extracted and opened it up inside VS Code, I want you to go inside the index.html and look at the starting code that we've created here. The goal is to not change any of the HTML, but actually write your code inside the style.css. And what we're trying to achieve is to turn this into this. And notice I've given you some little bits of hint. For example, the fact that every box has 10 pixels of padding on all four sides. And also notice that in the CSS code, there's already some existing code that basically just gets rid of some of the defaults and sets you up for the rest of the challenge. So don't change any of the existing code, either the CSS or the HTML. Look at the goal image, see what it's got, and you're going to need to write some code to change a number of things. So the first thing is these pieces of text should be white, as you can see here. It might be a little bit too difficult in terms of the contrast, but these should be white. And then notice how this text is actually inside a div that should be red. And similarly down here. The final thing is that there should be a div that encloses everything, and it should be colored purple. And notice that there is 10 pixels of padding here, there is 10 pixels of padding here, and there's 10 pixels of padding here. There's a number of things that you have to do using CSS and using what you've learned about the CSS cascade in order to achieve this. And the reason why the cascade is really important is because you can't add any additional classes, you can't change any of the HTML. So you're going to have to use everything that you've got access to in order to achieve this outcome. This is a tricky challenge, and I want you to spend some time thinking about it and thinking about what you've learned and referring back to maybe the previous parts of the video and revising what you've learned in this lesson. Pause the video now and complete this challenge. All right, I'm going to go through the solution so that you can check your work and make sure that you understand everything that's going on. So I'm going to pull up the goal image, so have it side by side with the current preview of the index.html. That way I can compare to see I've reached the goal or not. Now, the first thing I need to do is change this text to white, which is the easiest, because notice that these are in a particular class, whereas these don't have any class applied. So the class is white text, so I can go ahead and do that right here, use a class selector, choose the class I want, white text, and then go ahead and set the color of the text to white. There we go. So that's first part. So I'm getting closer to the final outcome. Now, the next thing I need to do is to make this box red. So this box is the box that encloses the white text, so it's this particular div. And notice that it's got two classes applied to it, box and inner box. So this inner box isn't actually present as a class on any of the rest of the divs, so I can select that quite easily. Up here next to my other box, I'm going to select the inner-box class, and I'm going to set the background color to red. Now, if we look inside our preview, you can see we're getting pretty close. Now, the next difference is this final outside box, which I want to be purple. This is the div that encloses everything, which is this one that has an ID of outer box. This is really the only thing that differentiates this div from any of the other divs, because they all share the class of box. This red div has the class of box, this blue div has the class of box, and this outer div also has that same class, which is why we're able to apply the 10 pixels of padding to all three simply using the original code of box. If I want to target this outer box, then I have to use the thing that's unique to it, which is the ID. So now I'm going to select the ID called outer box, and I'm going to set its background color to purple. And now you can see I have achieved the final goal outcome. The important thing here to realize is, firstly, we don't need to add any padding to the inner box or the outer box, because all three of those divs share a class called box, and that 10 pixels of padding is already applied there. Notice if I go ahead and go in here and set the padding, it doesn't change anything because it's already got 10 pixels of padding. But because the ID selector is more specific, if I say change the padding to 50 pixels, then it would actually be the one that will come out trumps. The second thing that I wanted you to realize is that the ID selector is more specific than the class selector. So even though for all three divs I've set the background color to blue, because this selects an ID, this will override it. Now, the other thing you have to realize is in order to set the inner box background color to red, this rule actually has to be below this rule, because watch as I move it up. Now, in this case, we don't have a red box anymore because these two have the same specificity. They're both selecting a class. Here we're setting it to red, but later on we set all the divs with a box class to blue. So this refers to the position of our CSS rule. Hopefully this will give you some practical experience with the CSS cascade and reinforce some of the lessons that we learned earlier. In the next lesson, we're going to learn how to combine different selectors so that we narrow down on a particular element that we want to select on screen, rather than simply broad stroke setting the CSS of everything. For all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson. In the last lesson, we looked at how the CSS cascade works when there are multiple rules that conflict with each other. But in this lesson, we're going to focus more on how to combine different CSS selectors so that we can target a very specific element in our website in order to apply our style. From the previous coding exercise, you might have remembered that there is a part where we had a paragraph element that we wanted to be yellow and another paragraph element that we wanted to be white. When we apply the CSS style to target all of the P tags and we give it a particular color, then what's going to happen is everything that is a paragraph tag is going to be turned yellow. In our case, we changed this white text by giving this paragraph tag a specific class, which we set to white text. Now, you can imagine if you had lots of different things in your website and they all had different color requirements, you can't go around setting each one with a different class, right? That would be a lot of work and a lot of clutter in your HTML. So what can we do instead? Well, we can combine different selectors in order to select something specific. So in this case, notice that the paragraph that we want to set to color white happens to live inside a different div. And this div already has a different class. It has box, but it also has inner box. And in our case, we only wanted the text in the inner box right here to be turned into white. So we can use that piece of information and combine these two things in order to select a specific element. What this rule does is it first looks at the elements with this particular class, and then it looks at any of the descendants of that class. So anywhere inside that div, could be one level down, could be 3 levels deep. As long as it's enclosed inside the div, it counts as a descendant, and we're looking for a paragraph element. And once we've found that, then that is the one that's going to get a white color. And now when we run this code, you'll notice that even though we haven't added any new classes to this paragraph element, it has been specifically selected using this combine selector right here, turning the text white. There are different ways that we can combine CSS selectors, and I want to show you some of these different rules. The first one is the group rule, and this is done using a comma. You can have one selector here and then another selector, and to separate them, we've got this comma and a space. And what the grouping does is it selects both of the selectors, or even more, 2 or 3 different selectors, and applies the same style to the entire group. So everything that's selected. Now we're going to try and apply what we just learned, grouping selectors, in order to have the preview of our index.html look like this. We want both the H1 and H2 to have a color of blue-violet. Let's put this into practice by going to the current lesson, downloading the starting files as a zip file, extracting it, and opening it in VS Code. Once you've extracted the files, I want you to first go into the index.html file, and I want you to take a look at the structure of the starting file. It's really important for any of the upcoming challenges that you don't change any of the HTML code. So don't add any extra classes, don't add any IDs, basically don't touch this entire index.html file. Instead, you're going to be writing all of your code inside the style.css. And you're going to be using CSS, and more specifically the different combinations of CSS selectors, in order to carry out the challenge goals. As you might remember, the first goal that we're trying to achieve is to target both the H1 and the H2 and make sure that they both have a blue-violet text color. And we're going to group our selectors to achieve this. Pause the video and write your code inside the style.css to complete the challenge. All right, so remember, to group a selector, we first write a selector, and then we add a comma, and then we add the second group of selectors. Now, in this case, I'm using the element selector, but it could be that you're grouping different classes, you could be grouping different IDs. It doesn't really matter, as long as you're aware that you have two different selectors separated by a comma. Here, we're going to change the color to a blue-violet color. And once I've done that, you can see we've got these two bits both with the same CSS applied to it. And this can be really handy when you're trying to save some time targeting different areas of your website. All right, let's look at some other different combiners. Now we can use the right angle bracket in order to select a child of another selector. So in this case, the first selector is the parent and the second selector is the child. What this means is that if we had a div where it opens here and it closes here, then inside here, a direct descendant, so just one level down, we might have a child. Let's say it's another div. Well, this then is the parent and this is the child. And the important thing is that this relationship is only one generation deep. In this case, when we want to select this particular div, then we can use this method by putting the parent, the right angle bracket, and then the child selector in order to select this particular element. And the most important thing to remember here is that it's a direct child. It's not a grandchild, not a great-grandchild. It has to be only one level nested inside. This selector has to be only one level inside this one. All right, let's try a practice run. Use this selector in order to change the index.html to set the first paragraph tag to a fire brick color. This is what you want your preview to look like. The next goal is to change the color of this paragraph element to a fire brick color. And in order to do this, we have to again study how we can select it specifically. Now notice here that it's got a class of done, but so do other things. It's got a paragraph element, but there are also other paragraph elements on screen. I want you to use what you've learned about the child selector in order to select this particular element and change its color. Pause the video now and give this a go. All right, so we mentioned that a child selector allows us to choose a parent and then specify something that is one level deep. So in this case, if this div was the parent, then you can see it has two child elements. One is this paragraph and another is the UL. Whereas these LIs, for example, they would not be children elements. They're actually grandchildren. Let's use what we learned in order to target this particular paragraph tag. In English, what our rule is going to specify is select the things that has a class of box and look at its children and find a paragraph element. This way, we distinguish this paragraph element from this one because it's not inside a div called box. It doesn't have a parent with that class. And also similar with this paragraph, it also doesn't have a parent that has a class of box. So let's go in here. Let's first select our parent using the selector for a class. And then using the right angle bracket, we're going to say, let's look for a direct descendant that is a paragraph element. And then let's set the color to a firebrick. You can see here, we've managed to set this particular paragraph's color to firebrick, but left these other paragraphs alone. The next combination we want to look at is the descendant combination. Here we've got two selectors. This is the ancestor and this is the descendant. So notice that here all we've got is a single space between the two selectors. And what this means is that our descendant selector is going to apply the style to this descendant as long as it has an ancestor that matches this selector. So that means that you can have many, many levels deep. For example, you could have a class here, you could have a different class here, and then maybe you have a paragraph element in here. So then you can specify the left-hand selector to select on this particular class. And as long as somewhere within its enclosing brackets there is a paragraph element, then this will be a valid descendant to select and apply your styles to. Let's try this out in code. What we want to do is we're going to try and select these three bullets here and give them a blue color. And we're going to use the descendant combination. In order to select these three here, if we look at the index.html, you can see that we've clearly got three list item elements. I don't want you to select on the list item. We're going to practice using the descendant selector instead. Make sure that you use the descendant combination in order to select these three items. And I want you to imagine that maybe there are other list item elements in the rest of the website. And we don't want to style them the same as what we've got here. So we're trying to turn the text blue just for these three bullet points, and we're not selecting on the list item element. We're instead using the descendant selectors. Pause the video and give that a go. All right, so as I mentioned previously, the easiest thing here would of course be simply to select all the LIs. But this is a very short website. Now imagine that your whole website is 2,000 lines long. There probably will be a lot other LI elements that you don't want to select on and apply this style. That's why we're going to use the descendant selector. Also, it's good practice for our learning. So in this case, notice that the LIs are a grandchild of this div. So we can simply select the box class and then use a space to say, let's find all the descendants that are LIs and change their color to blue. And that changes these three bullets. And notice because of this rule, it means that if I have any other LIs down here, then they don't get affected at all because my rule is very specific. And also notice how in this case, if I use the child selector, it's actually not going to work because the LI is 2 levels deep relative to this div that we're selecting. So we could select on the parent, which has the class list, but if we wanted to use the descendant selector, then we would have to use box as a class and then select all the LIs that are a descendant using this syntax. The next method I want to talk about is chaining selectors. And this looks really similar to the previous one where we had descendant selectors, so it's really important to pay attention here. When you chain a selector, effectively what you're doing is you're saying apply these styles to the instances where all the selectors are true. If we look at the way that we chain selectors, you can see we've got a selector and then we immediately add another selector. There is no space in between the two selectors whatsoever. So what this might look like is, let's say you had an H1, and this H1 also has some other attributes. Maybe it's got an ID of title. Maybe it's also got a class that's equal to big and heading. It's got two classes applied, one ID, and it's also an H1 element. If we had a whole bunch of other elements in our code, which also had the same ID or the same class, then we can use this chaining method to be really, really specific. That is the purpose of chaining. In order to get hold of this particular H1, we could say we're looking for an H1, and then without any spaces, we add immediately, say, a £sign to select on the ID of title. Now the selector says, look for an H1 that also has an ID of title. And then we can even add on another one. So we could say it also has the class of big. And it also has the class of heading. Now we have a super specific selector where we've chained all of these selectors together to apply to just one single element. Now, there could be many H1s. There shouldn't be, but there could. There could be many elements with the same ID. Again, there shouldn't be, but it could happen. But more commonly, there probably will be many elements with the same class. But maybe there won't be an element with both of these classes. So remember, you chain selectors by having no space between the selectors, and your selector includes that symbol at the beginning. So it could be dot for classes. It could be the £sign for IDs. And it could have nothing in front where it's just the element. In the case of the element, if you're trying to chain this selector with anything else, this has to go first, because otherwise it can be really confusing. Let's say you had a class of big and you wanted to say, well, it also is an H1. Because there's no space when we chain, this might just look like a class called big H1, which is not what you want. Always start off with the element if you want to chain an element. And then you can add on the class using any sort of dot, or you could use the £sign to add any sort of ID. And remember, leave no spaces in between if you want to say that all of these selectors are in a single element. And this is to differentiate when you say want to use the descendant selector, where you say that I'm looking for something that has this particular class, but it also has a parent, which is an H1. This is when you're looking for the descendant combination. So now your challenge is to figure out how to only select these two bullet points in order to turn them into the sea green color that you see right here. These are the two items that we want to select. So we could go for the class, which is done, but notice that there's other items with the class done, and we can't change the HTML code. How can we use this chaining method in order to get hold of these two items? Well, notice what's very specific about this. These are list item elements that have this particular class. We can't select on all the list items, and we can't select on all the ones with a class of done, but we can chain these two selectors together using what we just learned. Pause the video and try to make these two bullets a color of sea green. All right, so we're going to chain these two selectors. We're going to look for all the list item elements that has the class done, to differentiate between paragraph elements that have a class of done and this list item element that doesn't have the class done, and make it really specific so we select just these two list item elements. So first we select the element, which is list item elements, and remember there's no space between the two selectors when we want to chain, and the second selector is the class selector of done. I'm going to change the color to sea green, like this. Now, remember that when we're chaining selectors, you can imagine that if we have first had the class selector and then we add the list item element, it thinks that we're looking for a class called done.li, which doesn't make any sense at all. because our IDs and our class selectors have a special symbol, we always start off by selecting on the element, and then we add the other selectors. You can add it in order, it could be .done, and then you can add an ID, or you can select on the ID first and then the class. It doesn't really matter as long as the first item in the chain is your element. Now, the final thing I want to mention is we've looked at different ways of combining selectors, but remember that we can also combine these different combinations together. It gets a little bit more complex this way, but just in case you see it out in the world, I wanted to quickly explain this. So imagine if you wanted to select on something that has an ancestor that matches this selector, but then you use the chaining method in order to specifically select this item with these two selectors. Then you can combine all of this together and add that space in there and remove that space in there, or use the group, and you can combine lots of different combinations. Let's try this out and target this particular item right here and give it a font size of 0.5 rem so that it's much smaller than everything else on screen. And if you look at the code, it's a little bit tricky because this is a paragraph element that has a class of done, but there's also the same one up here, but we don't want to select this one. We just want this one, and we want to set its font size to 0.5 rem. So use what you learn and try out the different combinations in order to achieve that, to make this a tiny font size. Pause the video, give that a go. All right, what is different about this element and this element? Well, it's the fact that this one is inside a UL, whereas this one is inside a div. Normally inside a UL, you would see list item elements, but in this case, just for the example's sake, we've put in a paragraph element, which is totally valid as well, because you might have list elements that come up afterwards, and it could just be a line inside the unordered list. So now in order to select it, we're going to find a parent of UL that has a paragraph element that has a class of done. Let's do that here. So a UL as the ancestor, and then a paragraph element, and then a class of done, and we set the font size to 0.5 rem. And you can see that's achieved this. Now, the other way of doing this is, of course, using the child selector, which does the same thing right here, because it is an ancestor and it's also a parent in this case. So normally, unless you're sure that you only want the parent-child relationship, I prefer to use the descendant selector, because it's just a little bit more broad stroke, and normally you'll want to apply your style to multiple things that apply to that same rule. But both of these options are totally valid solutions, and I would consider you completely correct if you did either of them. The important thing for you to understand here is we've got an ancestor selector. We're using the space in order to say that this is the ancestor. This is not what we actually want to change the style to. But we're also using the chaining method to say this is quite specific and this is what we want to target. And notice that when you hover over these selectors, you actually see which element it's selecting as well, which can be really handy sometimes. Hopefully this has given you a little bit of insight into how different CSS selectors can be combined together in order to target specific things on the screen. In the next lesson, we're going to look at the CSS position property so that we can learn more about how the positioning of items works in CSS. So for all of that and more, I'll see you there. Now, so far, we've seen a lot of different intermediate CSS concepts already in this section. Now, I want to talk about something that is related to the positioning of elements on screen. And there are 4 different types that we're going to go through: relative, absolute, fixed, and static positioning. When developers don't understand positioning, or in this case, when building developers don't understand positioning, something like this might happen, either on your building, which is terrible, or on your website, which is also not great. So we're going to understand this concept in order for this to not happen. Now, if you're doing renovation work and your builders are doing this, then I'm not sure this video is going to help, but it's definitely going to help us position our items in our websites a lot better. As I mentioned, there are 4 different values for that property, position. It's static, relative, absolute, and fixed. And I want to show you how each of these values work and consider when you would need them. So the first one is static positioning, and this is actually the HTML default. As soon as you insert any piece of HTML, by default, they're going to have this particular positioning applied to them. And this basically means that each item flows as they would in our HTML. Now, if you head over to this website, appbury.github.io/CSS-positioning, then you can see that I've created a demo website for you to interactively see what each of these different styles of positioning would look like. Now, if the font here is too small because I needed to get enough space in here to scroll, feel free to go to View and then click on Zoom in and press the plus button until it fits whatever size your eyes require. Once you're here, you can click on the different styles of positioning, and the first style is static positioning. We can set the position property to a value of static, but we also don't have to. This is just applied by default. In this case, this is just what default HTML does. When you add another item here, so in this case I've got a div here which I've colored green. Once this has been added, it just goes at the bottom of whatever previous element there is. And you can see this quite easily if you've installed the pesticide Chrome plugin. Previously, I showed you how to get hold of the pesticide Chrome extension. And now if we hold down our control key, you can see we've got an H2 here, and then we've got a code element here. And then finally, we've got a div element here. So notice how that div just goes right at the end of whatever previous element there is. And we can also inspect the code here to see this is where it is. And it simply just continues in the default positioning. This is what static does. It's just what you've seen so far. Now, what's more interesting are the other 3 different types. And one of the most common ones you're going to come across that you're probably going to use is relative positioning. And this is where an item gets positioned relative to its default position. Remember previously in our static positioning, I told you that HTML just makes your items go one on top of the other with almost no space in between unless there is some sort of default. Well, relative positioning basically takes that original position and you can apply some changes to it so you can move it relative to where it should be. So in this case, where the purple box is where it should be, and where the blue box is, it's been shifted to be pushed from the left and from the top. So that gets this new relative position. Again, coming back to our website, if we select relative positioning, notice how these 2 other parts of our code now is relevant. We've got a push from the left and a push from the top. Whereas originally this box was supposed to be somewhere here-ish. I'm just going to draw a dash line for where it was when we had the static positioning. This is where it's supposed to be. Instead, we've moved it 50 pixels from the left using this line, and then we've moved it 50 pixels from the top using this line, and this works because it is positioned relative to the original supposed location. So now if we select this box, you can see it has position relative, left 50 pixels, top 50 pixels. And this box, if we select it, you can see it has position static, which means that the left and the top, it doesn't actually do anything because it's static position. So it's just default position. Doesn't matter if you add these properties, which you can, it just doesn't do anything. That's the difference between relative and static positioning. Relative positioning takes the static position and then you can move it relative to that location. Now remember, relative does not mean relative to anything else. It's relative to its supposed location. Some people get that confused and they think it's relative to something else on screen. No, we're going to remember this when you use relative positioning. Now the next type is absolute positioning. And this makes the position relative to the nearest positioned ancestor. Now, this sentence is a little bit confusing, but remember in the previous lesson, we spoke about the ancestors. So for example, if I had a div here that is a purple box, and inside that purple box, I put in another div, which is a blue box. Well, in this case, the blue box is a descendant and the purple box is an ancestor. If this particular div has the position property set, for example, if we set this as relative and we set the blue box to have a position as absolute, then this blue box is then going to be positioned relative to its positioned ancestor. And notice the wording here, the nearest ancestor. It could have multiple ancestors with position relative, but it's the nearest one that matters. If it doesn't have a positioned ancestor, then this second rule becomes valid, where it gets positioned relative to the top left corner of the web page, which is right here. Now, if you go and select the absolute positioning, notice how this box is now wildly weird in terms of its position. And this is because it has no ancestor that has the position property set. If we select our div right here, you can see this is where it is. And its ancestor is this div. And then going further up, we've also got this main element, which is also another ancestor. And then we've got the body and then the HTML. So this is the flow of how we get to this descendant. Now, because neither this div nor this main, nor the body, nor the HTML have the position property set, well, then in that case, this box is positioned relative to the top left of the web page. And what we said is position absolute, top 50 pixels, left 50 pixels. And that's exactly what it has done for us. It's pushed it from the top by 50 pixels, and it's pushed it from the left by 50 pixels. And this is relative to the top left corner of the web page. Remember that the first part of the absolute positioning rule is that if it had a position ancestor, then it would be positioned relative to that ancestor. So we can actually change our code here inside the inspector. Let's say we're going to take this box, so make sure you've actually selected the right box that has the absolute positioning, as you can see here. And let's find its ancestor. The first one I can see is this one. So we're going to select it, and then we're going to add a CSS rule. So we're going to go inside the element.style, which is going to add an inline style to this element we've selected. And I'm going to set its position to relative. Now notice how as soon as I've done that, our box has moved. And now what it's done is it's moved so that these rules that we've applied to this box, namely push it down from the top and push it down from the left, is now relative to its nearest position ancestor, which is this div right here. And if you look at this, you can see it has followed that rule. It's pushed it 50 pixels from the top of this div and 50 pixels from the left of this div. And it makes this true. And that's because we've got that code here on the box. The tricky thing about the absolute positioning is you have to make sure if you want it positioned relative to another item, you have to set that ancestor to have position relative, because otherwise it's going to default to positioning relative to the top left of the web page. Now, another aspect of absolute positioning that's important to mention while we're here is the Z index, as we would say in the UK. Or if you're American, it would be the Z index. Now, what this does is it determines which elements go on top of which in the z-axis. If we think of our web page as a graph where we have the y-axis going this way, the x-axis going horizontally this way, then we can also have a z-axis which actually goes in the third dimension, and that's the z-axis. This basically just determines which one goes on top of which. If A has a higher z-index, let's set it to 100, and B had a lower z-index, let's say it was 50, then this one is going to come out trumps and A is going to sit on top of B. And you can see this already happening with our absolute positioned box. You can see it's sitting on top of everything else. If we wanted to not do that, say we wanted to make this box go behind everything, well, then we can set this property called z-index, and we can make it even negative if we wanted to. Everything on screen has a default z-index of 0. But notice how even if I set the z-index of this box to 0, it still doesn't fit in with everything else. And that's because when you set something with absolute position, it actually takes the element out of the original HTML flow and puts it on another layer. This is why we can quite easily change it to a negative z-index to push it behind, or use the default, which will take it above, but we can't actually have it inside the flow anymore. For that to happen, we need to go back to static position or relative position. Now, the final type of positioning I want to talk about today is fixed positioning. And this is a position that is going to be relative to the top left corner of the browser window. Remember how absolute position defaults to the top left of the web page, but in this case, when it's fixed, it's going to be defaulted to the browser. And what that means is that even if you scroll up and down on the web page, it's still going to be located in the same location relative to the browser. So this is where a demo comes in really handy. Let's go into fixed positioning, and notice it looks the same as our absolute position until you start scrolling. And notice how it's just staying right there with 50 pixels pushed down from the top and from the left. And it doesn't matter where you scroll to, it's always going to hover right there. Whereas with absolute positioning, you can see it's relative to the web page and it moves with the web page. So have a think about this when you're using these different position styles in terms of what you want. Notice how in all 4 different positional values, I've set it to have a top and a left, and this is how we position things in addition to that position property. So you can also change this and set it to, instead of left, you can change that to right, and it would just move it to the right instead and have 50 pixels from the right. But in addition, you can also add extra margin. So notice how position actually goes outside of margin in the box model. So I can add an extra 50 pixels of margin and it will push it even further over here. The position is actually separate from the margin, which in turn is separate from the padding, which in turn is separate from the width and the height. But the really nice thing about position is notice how it's calculating these other values for you so that you maintain these positional values of 50 from the top and 50 from the right. And as I move it around, you can see how it's reacting to it. It's just changing the left side automatically to keep it in that position. If all of that seemed a little bit confusing, don't worry, we're going to solidify our knowledge by practicing it and writing it in code in an exercise. So go ahead and download the exercise from this lesson, CSS positioning, and extract it. And then once you open it, go ahead and open the index.html and then preview it on the right-hand side right here. You'll notice that it's an absolutely blank page because all we have in the HTML is a single div that contains another div. But by the end of this exercise, what we're aiming to do is to create a rectangle with a circle inside. Before you start, I first want to show you how you can create a circle using CSS. This is something that we haven't seen yet. So if I go ahead and target this red circle using the class selector, I can give it a background color of red so that we can actually see it on screen. And I'm also going to give it a width and a height. So it's going to be 200 pixels across and 200 pixels high. And once I've done that, you can see I've now got a square on the screen. So without a width and height, of course, it's not visible. And this is stuff that you should already know. So there's nothing new here. But if I go ahead and add a border radius, which will define the radii of the outer border, notice what happens here. Let's go ahead and give it a 5 pixel border radius. It makes the corners a little bit rounded. So we can extend this. Let's try 50 pixels. And you can see it now looks like an app icon almost, a little rounded square. But I can also use percentages. So if I set it to have a 50% border radius, then I create a perfect circle. And this is how we create circles in CSS. Now that you've got this red circle, it's only a matter of time before you get to the final outcome, which is a circle positioned on top of a rectangle. Now notice some things here. We want the rectangle to be 300 pixels tall and 500 pixels wide. And we also want it to be positioned, not using any margins, but using the position properties to be pushed down 200 from the top, 200 from the left. In addition, we want this circle to be positioned relative to the rectangle and 250 from the left, 150 from the top. This is going to test what you've learned, and if you can't figure out how to do it, I recommend instead of going forwards and looking at the solution, go backwards in the video and revise what we learned about positioning. And you will eventually be able to get there, I promise you. It's not too difficult, but you do have to do a little bit of thinking. Pause the video and try to complete this challenge. All right, so let's go through the solution. But before we do, I want to make sure you really try to understand the lesson, because pushing through with the code is not going to help you unless you actually understand what you're doing. Coding is all about thinking. It's not about memorizing things. It's not about knowing the answer, because you're going to get a different situation in the future and you need to make sure you know why things happen. And that requires a little bit of struggle. Let's go through the solution. So I'm going to create this rectangle, which has a class of blue box, and I'm going to give it a background color of a blue. And we see it show up because it contains a child element that has a height and width. So the parent obviously then has to have a height and width, but that's not the height and width that we want. We want it to be 300 pixels in height. And we want it to have 500 pixels in width. So now we have our rectangle and our circle correctly sized. Now it's all about positioning. Firstly, let's position this rectangle. We want it 200 pixels from the top, 200 pixels from the left. We can either do this using absolute positioning, because it will be relative to the top left if we don't set any of the other elements to have a position. Or we can set it using relative positioning, because remember that the default location is also going to be at the top left corner. I'm going to use relative positioning, and you're going to see very quickly why. But let's go ahead and set the position to relative. And then let's set it to have a top of 200 pixels to push it down 200 pixels here. And then let's give it a left of 200 pixels so that it's pushed 200 pixels from the left. And now we have this sort of image, which is already pretty close. Now we just have to move the circle. And this is where that relative positioning is going to come in handy, because we want to position this circle relative to the box. Notice how all of these sizes I've given are relative to this blue box. So 150 pixels from the top, 250 pixels from the left. And this is easily achieved if we set the position to absolute. And then we set the top to push down by 50 pixels and the left to push by 250 pixels. And now you can see we have exactly the same thing as our goal. Now notice these numbers. that I've given here, 150 pixels, 250 pixels. Basically, they are half. 250 is half of 500 and 150 is half of 300. Essentially, I wanted the top left corner of this circle to be right in the middle of the rectangle. Alternatively to setting these pixel values, you could have also set it to 50% from the top and 50% from the left. It would achieve exactly the same thing. But notice how this doesn't place it in the middle of the rectangle as some people would think, because this is the point that we're defining, the top left corner of this div. Now, even though the corners are rounded, it doesn't mean that this div isn't a box. It's still a box. It's the CSS box model. All we've done is we've said the top left corner should be 50% of the width from the left of the rectangle and 50% from the top of the rectangle. So if you wanted this circle to be bang in the middle, you would actually have to specify different values for the top and the left. Now, you could have actually solved this challenge in many different ways. This didn't have to be relative and this didn't have to be absolute. You could have, for example, set this position to be absolute, because then it would make this blue box relative to the top left corner because it doesn't have any other ancestors which have a position. Alternatively, you could have set this to fixed, because in this case, we don't have any other content on our website, so it doesn't actually scroll, and so you won't see that movement relative to the browser. As you can see, there's many ways of doing the same thing, but the important thing is when your code gets more complex, when there's more items in your HTML, that you understand what your CSS is doing and how to resolve any conflicts or when it's not doing what you expect it to, so that you understand what code you're actually writing and how it's behaving. Now that we know a little bit more about positioning, we can head over to the next lesson where I've got a final project for this section where we're going to create the flag of Laos using everything we've learned so far. For all of that and more, I'll see you there. It's now time for the final project, and in this project, we're going to be building a flag of Laos using only CSS and HTML. If you take a look at this image, it looks like an oil painting, right? But actually, if you look behind the scenes, this is created completely just with HTML and CSS, which is completely crazy. If you head over to this URL, you'll see the portfolio of Diana Adrian, who is a CSS artist. And if you right-click on this image and you inspect it, you can see that all aspects of this painting is all created using CSS, which is completely mind-blowing. For example, if we take a look at something really simple, the hair here, you can see there are like 1 million divs in here, each strand having a div. And then if you look inside each strand, you can see they've got border radius set, width, height, different colors, etc. And it's this crazy complex CSS art. If you're not into oil paintings, then maybe you're into The Simpsons. These images of The Simpsons were all created using CSS. And if you head over to this URL, then you can actually click on each of these characters and you can see the CSS that was used to create them. And it's not surprising that it's a ton of CSS to write. So don't worry, this is not your challenge. We're not going to be creating something crazy like Krusty the Clown with 875 lines of CSS. It's just for you to be aware of the power of CSS. And once we learn the different ways of combining selectors, of the specificity of CSS selectors, positioning things, different properties, you can in fact eventually create crazy stuff like this if you have a ton of time and probably an artistic streak as well. Most of the time when I work with CSS, my results look like this weird Pikachu where things are not positioned correctly and everything's just moving in the wrong directions. So you're not alone. Most people write CSS code that creates weird Pikachus. The important thing is we understand why we get weird Pikachus and why the eyeballs are so far down. So we're going to consolidate what we learned in this lesson by creating the flag of Laos. And this is going to test everything you've learned about combining different CSS selectors, about CSS specificity, the CSS cascade, and also about positioning. And in the end, we will have this beautiful picture of the flag of Laos. Go ahead and download the starting project files and extract it. Now here, if you open up the index.html, you will see some very simple HTML that I've already set up for you. And if you preview it on the right, you'll see it has pretty much nothing, which is a great starting point for your project. The important thing is you don't change any of the HTML, so don't touch the index.html file at all. It's purposely vague in terms of classes and IDs, and nothing is really tagged with anything, right? And this is because we're doing a challenge, right? You could, of course, add loads of classes, loads of IDs, and make this project super, super easy. But I want to test you on what you've learned so far. So that's why the initial index.html has basically nothing for you to be able to target with your selectors. Instead, you have to be a little bit more crafty. What we're aiming for is this. The flag doesn't have to be centered or positioned in any sort of particular way. This is going to be the top left corner right here, and then it's going to be a sort of rectangle that occupies part of your website. But the important thing is that it has these different aspects to it. It's got a red section here, which is 50% of this blue section here. And then it's got another red section down here, which is also similar in terms of how much it occupies. And how it works is there is a big red div right here, and above it, there is this blue div on top. So that should already help you in terms of how this layout should look. Now, the next thing is we've got a paragraph element that's located at the top, and we've got another paragraph element that has to be inside a white circle. If you take a look inside the index.html, you'll notice that there are some hints in here. For example, the width and height of the flag, and also the width and height of the circle. If you want to get hold of the precise colors, remember previously we learned about CSS inspection, and I've added a URL in here for you to be able to inspect on the actual image of the flag of Laos. This will test you on something you've learned previously as well. Remember, you can also right-click on the solution without opening the file and show it as a preview. And you can, of course, take the URL from VS Code and paste it inside your browser in order to see what the final outcome should look like, so you can better compare your version versus this version. You can do this in many, many different ways. And the main thing I want to know is that you know how to combine selectors, you know about CSS specificity, and you know how to position things roughly on screen. Once you're ready, pause the video and complete the project. All right, let's go through the solution together. The first thing is to style the outermost div, which has a class of flag. So this is probably going to be the easiest part of this whole project. We can target that div and set it to be 900 pixels wide and 600 pixels high so that we have a rectangle. Now next, we're going to have to set the background color so we can actually see it, so that it's not white. In order to get the colors of the flag, remember I said we should inspect on it, and then we can go into the three dots, more tools, CSS overview, and if we capture the overview, we'll get our hex code. So the red, which is our first box, has this hex code, which I'm going to copy and then paste into here. And now we have a very large rectangle in our preview. Now the next step is to add this second rectangle on top of it. If we take a look at our HTML, you can see we've got a div with class flag as the highest most div. And then we've got as its children a paragraph element and another div. And then we've got finally another div and a paragraph element. So this second div enclosed is going to be the one that we're going to turn blue. Remember I said we can't change any HTML So we can't add any classes or IDs to it. Instead, we're going to combine some selectors to select this particular div. So what is an identifying feature of it? Well, it is the direct descendant, the immediate child of this div class. So we can use the child combination by saying, let's get the class flag and then the angle bracket and then the child div. And in this div, we're going to go ahead and give it a width and a height. The width, we want it to be 100% of its parent. So I'm just going to write 100% and it should end up being 900 pixels. Alternatively, you can write the pixel number. Next, we're going to give it a height and I'm going to say 300 pixels. This way it takes up exactly half the height of the big red part. Now we just need to give it a background color in order to see it, and the color is going to be this blue color. And there we have it. We have a blue rectangle inside a red rectangle. Before we get busy positioning things, let's just make sure that we've got everything on screen first. So I want the circle to show up. And coming back to our HTML, you can see we've got one div. This is the red rectangle. Inside there's another div, which is the blue rectangle. And finally inside that, we've got another div, which we're going to turn into the circle. How do we get hold of this one? Well, we could use the descendant selector because this div is the immediate child of this div, which is then a child of this div. So we're saying it's 3 levels down. And we can do that by saying the flag class has a child, which is a div, which has another child, which is a div. And this particular div, we're going to give it a width of 200 pixels and a height of 200 pixels. And we're going to give it a background color of white. And we should now see a little square here. And in order to turn it into a circle, we set the border radius to 50%. So now we've got all 3 shapes on screen and it's time to try and position them so they look a bit more like this. Notice that this blue rectangle is not only half the size of the rectangle, but it's also shifted down by a quarter. So we want to set its position. Now, as I mentioned, in order to set the position of an element relative to a parent, what you need is for the child element, so in this case, this rectangle that's inside this blue rectangle that's inside the red rectangle, to have a position type of absolute. And then if its parent has a position type of relative, then we can now set this blue rectangle relative to this red rectangle. So we can say from the top, let's shift it down by 150 pixels, which is a quarter of 900 pixels. Even though we set this red rectangle to have position relative and we didn't move it at all, by setting it to relative, it enables us to modify the children's position relative to that parent. And this is why you'll very commonly see this structure, a parent having position relative and a child having position absolute. And then we move it relative to the parent. Using the same strategy, we can do the same thing for our circle, because our circle basically has to be in the middle of the red rectangle. If we set the position of this white circle to be position relative, then we can set it relative to its parent, which is the blue rectangle. So in order to move it to the center of the blue rectangle, we have to shift it down, so from the top by 50 pixels, because if we know that this height is 300 pixels, then half of it is going to be 150. So then if we know that the radius of this circle is 100 pixels, because it's got a total height of 200 and a width of 200, then we know that in order for it to be in the center, it needs to be 50 pixels from the top. And by a similar calculation, we can work out that it needs to be 350 pixels from the left. Even though we did all our calculations correctly, you can see this white circle doesn't quite look like it's right in the middle of this blue rectangle, right? It's a little bit shifted to the lower part. So we can diagnose our issues using pesticide. In this case, you can see that we've got a div here, but we've also got a box above it, and this is the paragraph element. And if we go ahead and inspect it inside the Chrome Inspector, you can see that paragraph element has a margin top and margin bottom. And if I go ahead and delete both of those margins, then you can see our circle shifts bang into the middle. So it's actually the margin around the paragraph element that's actually pushing the circle down, because it is within the flow of the HTML, because by default, all elements are statically placed in the flow of HTML. Let's go ahead and implement that in our code. We can select all the paragraph elements and set their margin to 0. And you can see immediately our circle is now centered in the screen. In addition, if we look at the goal image, we want to have the text super large. You can play around with the font size, but the one that I used is 5 rem. And this will get you pretty much the same size that you see here. In addition, the text is centered both inside the circle and at the top. So we need to set our text align to center, and that gets it pretty much where it needs to be. Now, the very last thing we need to do is to change the color of this part to white and this part to black. One way that we could do it is to simply set the color for all the text to white, and this will turn everything white and we'll no longer be able to see this text, even though it does exist. And if we wanted to select that particular paragraph element, we don't have a good way of selecting it with class or ID because we're not letting you change this HTML, but you can of course use different combinations to get there. For example, this paragraph element is a child of a div, of another div, of another div, of a body. There's actually a cheat code to doing this. If we open up the inspector and find that paragraph element we want to select, right-click on it, go to copy, and then copy selector. Once you paste it in here, you'll see it's actually the selector that will allow us to target that exact bit that we wanted to. I don't recommend blindly copy and pasting things. So this is a little bit of a cheat code, but because we now understand how this works, we can actually simplify this massively. We know that what it's saying is find the body, find its child that's a div, find its child that's div, and then another child, and then 3 levels deep, there should be a paragraph tag, which needs to be black. Because we understand this, we can vastly simplify it by getting rid of that body, or we could change this to the class flag, which would do exactly the same. And we can even swap out these child symbols and keep it as a descendant selector. So a paragraph element that is a child of a div, a grandchild of another div, and a great-grandchild of something that has this class, we'll select it and make it black. This is a little bit of a roundabout way of achieving the goal. You might have done something completely different. For example, we know that by default everything is black, so you could have also selected this paragraph element and turned it white instead. But I just wanted to demo to you a neat feature of Chrome Inspector, show you the cheat code after you've done the exercise, and let you know that this is also a possible way that you could try out in the future. So now if we compare our flag with the solution flag, you can see it's completely identical. Now, it might not be for you because maybe you've used a different method for positioning, maybe you've changed the font size to a different font size, but essentially you should be close to this layout. And hopefully in the process, you've managed to use some of the skills that you learned in this section. The inspiration for this project comes from a website I came across by Michael Laskaridis, And he basically classified world flags in order of difficulty to draw. So you can see all the way down here, there is Serbia, which is pretty much the most complex flag to draw because of the shield. And there are other countries like Croatia or Mexico, but at the very top, there are the simplest flags, for example, Palau or Nigeria or Peru. So if you want to have a go drawing your own country's flag, hopefully you're not in Serbia. If you are, then good luck. But if you're based in Austria or Bangladesh, then this should be quite doable using the skills that you've learned with CSS. Enjoy, and I'll see you on the next section. Hey guys, today it's Angela and the Office Crayfish. The Office Crayfish and I would like to congratulate you on getting this far. So well done for completing the last module, and we're both really proud of you. Now today I want to talk about something that I've heard students say a lot, and you know, it's this idea like, maybe like I'm not cut out for programming. Maybe like I just wasn't born with the particular brain that it requires to think in this way. Maybe like this is just not for me. And you know, why is it that so and so, like they just pick it up like that? Like why are they like just born to do it, you know? And what I want to say to that is like nobody is born to have a certain skill, right? Or, you know, there's a lot of things that require a lot of dedication to be able to achieve the result that people get. You just don't see it, that's all. Now, you know, you never see like a baby like just being born, it's all like really muscular, right? Like that doesn't happen. In order to get muscular, in order to get strong, you gotta go to the gym. You gotta put in the reps. Like nobody can help you with that. No matter how rich or how privileged or how smart you are, if you don't go to the gym, you're not going to get stronger. And it's the same with a lot of other skills. You know, like with programming, I would bet that there is no one programmer who you can find who hasn't done the work. Like, you don't just show up on your day one and you're like, wow, I know everything. That doesn't work. And in most cases, like, you know, people often hide like the hard work that's required in order to get to where they are. Like, if you think about the game Pokemon Go, like, do you remember that from like a few years ago? How it just blew up overnight, and literally everybody who was walking around was playing Pokemon Go, I swear. And the newspapers were saying like, oh, overnight sensation Pokemon Go, and it's like, you know, the creators stumbled upon like some sort of pot of gold. But actually, like, do you know how many other games that Niantic and the founders of Niantic have built before that? Like, how many have failed and how many were just kind of meh, like, until they had this big moment? We don't see that, but it doesn't mean it doesn't happen, right? So, in order to get good at something, you gotta show up. You gotta put in the hours, and then you'll get the results that you deserve. And in fact, you know, like, if you suddenly just like win the lottery and you get something that you haven't really worked hard for, you don't really cherish it. Like, if somebody gives you a gift and you didn't have to work hard for it, it's not the same as the thing that, you know, you worked a whole summer for, like washing dishes. Like, I certainly remember that. Like, that thing that you buy is so different from something that somebody just like gives you. So put in the work, put in the effort, and the results will happen, I promise. And I am here for you, and I'm here cheering you on. I believe in you, and I think you're going to do great. So just keep going.